Hi, I'm Jason Smart, a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I also happen to be a political scientist who studies Russian power, namely Russian foreign policy during the era of Vladimir Putin. And there's been a lot going on that's definitely worth chatting about. So this week, there's been a few things that happened. One, we saw that Putin has called for direct talks, bilateral talks, with the Ukrainians in Istanbul, Turkey. Interestingly enough, the Ukrainians responded back immediately. Zelensky said, "Great, I'll see you on Thursday. I'll be waiting for you in Istanbul." At the same time, we see that Xi Jinping's response, as well as the European response, as well as the American response, have all been different, and I think of what Putin had expected. So let's start with the Russians. So after midnight today, that is Sunday, Putin decided to hold a press conference. Now, it's quite unusual for the dictator to hold his press conferences this late at night. It's never happened before, as far as I can tell. And what was interesting about these talks, or the specific press conference, is that though he often talks about fighting fascism and thanked his international partners, this time he made a point about the need to come to an agreement with Ukraine and to hold bilateral talks without mediators. And it's probably no coincidence that just a few days before, the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine had said that it was concerned that there would be a large-scale aerial attack on the Ukrainians in the imminent future by the Russians. These two things are tied together. Why so? Vladimir Putin, in a traditional Russian tactic, was trying to be two things. One, the guy who creates disorder, creates fear, that it says that there's going to be a massive aerial strike, or the Americans warn there will be one. At the same time, he is the one who comes out with a press conference saying he wants peace. He's trying to make a situation work out where there's not going to be a further war with Ukraine. And that's why I think that he was so surprised when he got the response from Zelensky. And the response was a great response because it was short, clear, and direct. "See you Thursday. I'll be waiting for you." He didn't stall. He didn't hedge his bets. He called the bluff. He knew that Putin always does this. Putin always acts like the guy who wants to have peace, but the guy who's actually doing everything against having peace. And speaking of having peace, the man of peace, Pope Leo XIV today, before 100,000 people at the Vatican, said that he was hoping that there would be a just and lasting peace. Now, these words specifically of what he's looking for are great. And the reason is simple. Because these are exactly the words that Ukrainian diplomats always use. That Ukraine doesn't want peace, but a just and lasting peace. So it's probably no coincidence that the Holy Father decided to use these words. More than that, when he was still the bishop back there in Peru, he said, at least once that we know of, that Russia's war against Ukraine was an imperialistic war against the Ukrainians. And that's absolutely the case. We see that in the case of the U.S. President Donald Trump, that he also seems to increasingly realize that perhaps there's something wrong here. Perhaps, despite everything he had thought, it's not the Ukrainians who don't want peace. It's, in fact, the Russians who don't want peace, as we all very well know. Now, I think the silence for the past couple of days, from the Chinese is fascinating. So let's remember, the Chinese did attend the May 9th parade in Moscow. And despite attending that parade, they haven't said much afterwards. And why is that? Well, I think there's a very simple reason. So the Chinese are currently in trade talks with the Americans about the tariffs that Trump put on them. Those trade talks in Switzerland are going to be vital for the future of China. And more than that, let's put into conceptualized terms of how much money we're talking about. So about 40% of trade that is done with China globally is with the United States and with Europe. Specifically those countries that are NATO. So 40%. Russia, by contrast, is less than 4%. At the same time, Russia, though, about 15% of all the trade it does is with China. So Russia definitely needs China. China does not need Russia nearly as much. And there's another factor here that's very important to analyze. In the U.S. now, there's sort of a hunger for new sanctions against Russia. A bipartisan bill led by Senator Lindsey Graham has proposed up to 500% tariffs on buyers of Russian oil. So that Putin might have been very proud to get that handshake on Red Square during his parade for Victory Day. I think it's a little bit more strategically important for the Chinese to make sure that they don't crash their entire economy due to the fact that they continue to work with the Russians. So that's a pressure that undoubtedly Putin knows that he can't stand up for much longer against. And when you consider Russia's other so-called allies, such as Turkey and Erdoğan, this whole game, though he is the leader of NATO, has always tried to be sort of a middleman in how he dealt with the Russians. Now, at this point in time, though, it seems that there's more than a role than just a simple middleman. He could be the broker of peace. that's something that would be a huge achievement, not only for himself, but for Turkey as a whole, and to elevate them on the global stage. As one senior Ukrainian official told me just a few hours ago, this is Erdogan's moment to flex geopolitical muscle like never before. So how about Europe? Well, Europe is strongly united. Just last week, the leaders of France, Germany, the UK, Poland all traveled together to Kyiv, and they stood with Zelensky, not just in words, but in policy. And they came through strongly back Ukraine. So we see that even if the United States continues to move off the global chessboard, as no longer as involved in Ukraine as it was before, the Europeans do appear ready to pick up the slack and to do more to support Ukraine, as every day it's attacked. Every day, Kyiv, Dnipro, Odessa, and other cities are being attacked by Shahed drones that are produced by the Iranians. It's a global alliance that's working against us. It's not simply Putin against Ukraine. Rather, it's Iran, who's also working with North Korea, who's also working with Venezuela. Maduro, remember, was also at the May 9th parade. This global alliance of evil is fighting against Ukraine, yes, but it's also fighting against us, the West, as a group, as a collective, globally, day in and day out. So what else do we see happening? Well, I see a few other key things happening. We see that Vladimir Putin's economic system continues to have significant economic problems. Can the Putin regime continue? It's a really legitimate question. And I would argue, no, it probably can't. Putin, especially if the Chinese turn the screws on them, the Russians have nowhere else to go. They have very few other options. Obviously, the Venezuelans cannot do anything to prop up the Russian government or prop up the Russian economy. And countries like Iran are having their own significant internal problems that do not allow them to be a significant partner of Russia in the way that Russia would need to continue waging this war. At this time, it seems that a lot's changed for Putin, and the script has been flipped. He offered peace talks, the Ukrainians took him up on it immediately, and now he cannot just hide behind excuses as he had before. He's actually embarrassed, not just before the West, which obviously he doesn't care much about at this point. He's embarrassed before his allies, those countries like China, who at this point have to say, listen, as much as we love you, as much as we're allied with you, as much as we're always going to be there together, at this point in time, we have to take a walk. We can't afford to continue helping you as we had before. So if Putin fails to make good on his promises for peace, this might be a big deal because it will imply that there's going to be serious sanctions coming his direction. And those are the sort of sanctions that, as I've said for already 3 years, are the types that could actually crush the Russian economy. And if the Russian economy goes completely berserk, there's a big problem for Putin. Unlike in the earlier days in the Soviet Union, where there was an entire system that could be blamed, you could blame the Politburo, you could blame the other socialist states, you could blame a lot of things. In modern Russia, there's no one else to blame. Putin has put all of the weight of the country on his own shoulders, by his own choice, because he's chosen to create a dictatorship that operates only through him. And so though that might be good at some points to have absolute authority and absolute power, one of the big downsides is when things go wrong, there's no one else to blame. And I do think the Putin regime is becoming increasingly destabilized. And overall, when you talk to others who study Russia and specifically say the Putin regime or study the Russian economy, they always come to the same conclusions. Russia is in an untenable situation. It cannot continue like this forever. Now, a very good question is, does Putin really recognize this? Does he recognize how bad his situation is? Or does he think he can continue just sort of kicking the can down the road? I'd argue that Putin probably actually does realize, or increasingly realizes, how bad his situation has become. Increasingly, it's become impossible for Putin to just ignore all the different signs, whether it's the huge banking problems, the problems in the construction industry, the problems within the military-industrial complex. These are all significant problems. And they're all part of the reason that I think Putin, also at the same time, flipping the coin, might say we have to continue the war. So why is that? So the entire Russian economy is already in recession. It's not able to sustain itself. So if Vladimir Putin doesn't do something to fix that, things will only get worse. Printing more money is definitely not going to help the Russian economy, as inflation is already a disaster. But here's why he might want to continue the war. The military-industrial complex is the only thing creating growth. And though that's got big problems, why? Well, for one, if you produce something, say a tank, let's say you spend $1 million on a tank, and you send it off to Ukraine, and a couple of days later it gets blown up, that money is no longer circulating the economy as it had. The tank just got destroyed, and you can't even drag it back to make scrap metal out of it. So you've got a big problem. So he's pumping tons of money into things that get destroyed, pumping money into Russian soldiers who get killed, and then their families receive cash benefits. Those cash benefits create a sugar high in the economy. They create an artificial uplift for a moment, But once the money's spent and it's gone, it's over. And it's just created more inflation. Vladimir Putin's general economic situation is very complex. So given the fact that he's facing international threats or pressures from countries such as China, who don't want to be underneath U.S. sanctions, or he's facing geopolitical problems globally, such as the fall of his Syrian regime, Assad, who he had backed for years, which took away Russia's ability to project power through Central Africa, where it had been for years engaged in illegal mining and enslaving the local populations, or in the case of countries like Venezuela, who are trying to start talks with the U.S. now to avoid more sanctions and to get off the sanctions list, or to be able to produce more oil, which would drive down the oil prices, which would then, again, hurt Russia. All these things work together against Putin's interest. So when we look at the scene globally, though Vladimir Putin might seem very proud, though May 9th might have seemed like a great success, I would argue that Vladimir Putin has a lot to be worried about. And if I was him, I'd be very worried about what's going to happen next. Because there's one thing that we do know about dictators. As strong as they seem, as much as it might seem that they'll be in power forever, one day they do end. And historically, statistically, a dictator like Putin has a very good chance of having an ending that comes very quickly and very violently. Thank you.